On episode 136 of the Vincast, I chat with Michael John Corbett, Kiwi-born winemaker behind Vanguardist Wines. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Guestbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. Great to have you with us as always. Very excited to be able to have a little bit more regularity with new episodes, and it's great to be able to share some of these fantastic stories from people behind the wines that you enjoy, and I really want to show my appreciation for people who have supported me in the last sort of 7 or 8 months since I launched my own little wine brand, Vino Intrepido. I'm very excited later this month to be heading down to Hobart for the Bottle Tops Wine Festival at Franklin and Tommy Hugo's. So I'll be pouring my Vino Intrepido wines there. I do hope to see you there if you haven't already bought your tickets. Obviously, it's part of the Dark Mofo event, which is an amazing an experience. I've been told. I haven't actually experienced it myself so far, so I'm really excited to be able to head down myself. But yeah, hope to see you there. Speaking of my own wines, a little while ago, when I was in the warehouse just checking on my wines, I was approached by someone who told me that they liked the podcast, and they introduced themselves as this week's guest, Michael John Corbett, who is the winemaker behind Vanguardist Wines, which is a brand that's really getting a lot of attention, particularly here in Melbourne. A lot of the top somms are pouring Michael's wines, and I can understand why, having tasted them myself. So I was able to sit down with Michael when he was recently over in Melbourne releasing some new vintages, and it was great to hear about his story. So I do hope you enjoy the episode. Please do stick around until the end to find out how you can get in contact with us. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Michael, thank you for making the trek out to the official Vincast studio whilst you're here in Melbourne showing new release wines, and obviously thank you very much for inviting me along to the event the other day. It was great to see some of the new wines and, of course, taste some of the wines on a previous episode of Let's Taste. But thank you for being on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Michael, I start every episode, as you possibly might know, by asking my guests the first interaction they had with wine that made them think about it in a different way and possibly started them on that path towards a career in the wine industry.
I remember the first wine that had a real impact on me was a Trinity Hill Merlot, of all things, from the 99 vintage in Hawke's Bay. And it's the first time I saw wine in a slightly different light, having had a very amateur entry before that.
Whereabouts did you grow up?
In Hawke's Bay.
Oh, you're from that region, right? Yeah. Okay. And your family's not involved with wine at all?
First generation.
Yeah. What sort of what was their trade?
My father's a refrigerator and general engineer, and mother just was really a full-time mother, so not a super close family that had any links to wine at all, really.
Right. And tell me about the context of drinking this Trinity Hill wine.
I was sitting in an Italian restaurant with a young lady that later became my wife, and then didn't stay a wife. But it was just an experience for a young person. I was in my very early 20s, and I just remember flavors and textures and an experience that I probably haven't had with a beverage at all before.
Right. What were you doing at the time? Were you studying anything? Or working?
I was actually working in hospitality, so doing a little bit of stuff in the kitchen as well as managing bars. Quite a big complex in Hawke's Bay at that point in time, which is no longer there.
Right. Okay. Did you have particular ideas about what you wanted to do as far as a career, or
I was actually I was going to be a professional golfer.
Really?
So this is probably just after the time that I retired essentially from golf at about the age of just before my 21st birthday.
Wow. Isn't that the normal age, like the gymnasts retire?
Yeah,
I've never heard of golfers retiring that early.
It was a very It was a very young age.
That's when I picked it up.
I was very brash and I don't know, probably a bit arrogant and maybe a bit lost in my life at this point. So may have been a bad decision to quit golf because I didn't really have the opportunity to have a real crack at it. Even though I had a good couple of years playing close to full time. But it led me into what is now my ultimate passion, which is what I live and breathe now, which is wine.
And how did you sort of take your first steps? Was hospitality the way that you kind of explored a little bit more and started you on that path?
Absolutely, yeah. It was that working in there was actually an Irish pub, there was a family restaurant, there was a fine dining restaurant, there was a seafood restaurant, and I just explored a little bit more with food than I had before, and then that rolled into wine. Obviously, Hawke's Bay is quite wine eccentric as a place to be, and then I guess I had some experiences which really switched me on, and then pretty quickly made the decision to study Bachelor of Wine Science.
How developed was Hawke's Bay as a wine producing region, and probably more importantly, as far as wine tourism at the time?
I think it was pretty good for what is a fairly small region. That's not super easy to get to. I think it was a quite a high end region for New Zealand. So there was good exposure. There's a lot of good cellar doors in and around the likes of Gimlet Gravels with places like Trinity Hill and Tamata Estate and Craigie Range sort of a standout off the top of my head. So there was good exposure and there was good opportunity to actually go out and taste wines easily, which was great.
And what was it that made you decide to follow winemaking as a career path? If you were working in hospitality previously, do you remember why you didn't kind of continue down that pathway?
There was a couple of reasons. I was actually very interested in food, and I actually believed that I had some really talented chefs that I saw working and awkwardly saw them probably in that awkward situation of drugs and alcohol being quite a big part of their lives, and I was a little bit concerned with my personality that I could get trapped in that circle.
If you were like that into golf at the time, for example, that you kind of wanted to follow a career path as a professional, it seems like you kind of somewhat of an addictive personality and kind of really get into something.
Yeah, that would be very fair to say. Sometimes it doesn't last for a long time, but when I have a crack, it's all or nothing. And wine has stuck for quite some time now, which is a nice thing.
And so winemaking was the choice.
Yeah, and
I guess slightly safer vices.
It's slightly safer vices, but I guess with wine, it's such an exploration that you'll never master it. There's always something new. There's more to taste. There's more to see. Vintage are changing, so it's a totally different world for me where you can never get bored.
So, did someone say, "Oh, you should go and study," or did you kind of go, "Well, how do I become a winemaker?" Oh, I go and study.
Yeah, no, I guess my ex saw maybe that little twinkle about wine pretty early and supported me and encouraged me to do the course. So with that sort of support, it was an easy decision to make. Very, very difficult initially because I didn't study any science at school. I was very adamant that I didn't want to study science. So to go into a science degree, I had to do bridging courses and things like that. But once we got over that hurdle, it rolled on really nicely.
So where did you study?
At EIT in Hawke's Bay.
Oh, okay. So there is is it sizable or quite small?
It's not a big place, but they were at that point, and I'm not sure if it's still correct that they were doing the Charles Sturt course. So they were delivering that same course over in New Zealand.
Ah, right. Okay.
But a really great spot, obviously in the heart of Hawke's Bay, so you had good access to wineries. There was a small winery on site, which was actually a really nice little winery, and good resources. So I'm very happy with the course content there.
Got a lot out of the course?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it was very good. It gave you a good understanding, a good ability to make decisions and find research, I guess, more around problems rather than teaching you how to make wine.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
At the time, I'm sure you were kind of looking at tasting wines and being inspired somewhat. Did you have particular ideas about working in Hawke's Bay, or did you have ideas about, as you were tasting wines, possibly from other parts of New Zealand or Australia or from Europe, for example, did you have aspersions to, go and travel and work overseas?
Yeah, so pretty quickly I started traveling, and I don't know, I was exposed to Hawke's Bay first, so we're talking Syrah, Bordeaux blends, Chardonnay, and then quickly you peek out into maybe Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, Central Otago Pinot, but sort of found an affiliation pretty early on with Semillon, which was probably a slightly strange thing, and Semillon from Gisborne, which then piqued my interest in Australian Semillon, specifically Hunter Semillon. So the first vintage abroad was to Tyrrell's. I did that for a couple of years, and then ventured out to Europe, to France. And I think, of around about 22 vintages, there's 4 countries and 12 regions that I've covered now, and probably will keep going with a little bit more.
Yeah, right. Okay. Where was the first European vintage?
That was in the Languedoc, in the Minervois,
Mm-hmm.
in France, and had a really great experience there. And during that time, I travelled a little bit further south into the Roussillon, to a very small village called Maury, where I ended up falling in love almost instantly with Grenache.
Mm.
So since then, I've spent 4 more vintages down there, and there's some pretty strong plans in the pipeline where we're going to start producing our own wine over there as well.
Grenache, not a variety you find that much in New Zealand?
No, I didn't even know about it being planted when I was there. I think there was some young vines around the Gimlet Gravels and around the Tarawa Triangle. But
are there many other Rhone varieties in the Gimlet Gravel?
No, obviously Syrah is really strong, and my experience with it was quite low at that point, so I hadn't really explored a lot and didn't understand it really well outside of Syrah. I'm sure that it probably has other Rhone varietals planted, but my concern is maybe that it's too volatile. Like it's probably going to be a 5 and 10 or a 7 and 10 or a 3 and 10 year.
Struggle to get ripeness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
What about like Viognier, for example?
Yeah, there's definitely Viognier, I think, growing quite well there. Stylistically, yeah, it's a tough variety anyway. So which style do you go? A slightly fresher approach, or that really unctuous, rich approach. I suppose driven more by vintage than maybe necessarily style with the winemaker's hands.
So once you finished your studies, did you have somewhat of a nomadic existence? You're working vintages in Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere?
Yeah, definitely.
Alternating?
I bunkered down for a couple of years after doing Australia, New Zealand, and France, but it didn't last very long. I think I stayed in Hawke's Bay for about 2 or 3 years, and then I suppose the loss of my marriage probably dictated flexibility again, and I pretty quickly packed my bags and actually went to America from there before heading back to France and then to Australia, and then that continued for a few more years and has really only slowed down in the last couple of years because of Vanguardist Wines growing and needing a lot more of my time outside of just the winemaking season. So,
how did you find the US experience?
It was a really good one. It was probably a good timing for me where I was having a bit of a struggle personally to immerse myself into a job with the Kendall Jackson family at La Crema. We had an extremely big vintage there, and I had sort of a nighttime winemaker sort of supervisory role with a lot of people to look after. So I didn't have too much chance to think about some of the less fun stuff that had happened in my life at that time, and it was really interesting because it was a lot of really high quality fruit, but in big volumes like I'd never seen before. Hand harvested fruit. I think around about 7,000 or 8,000 tons of hand harvested fruit, which was quite epic in its first sense, and treating them as really good batches, but on a big scale. It was very interesting and obviously culturally very different from I think the rest of the world.
What was your
reason for going to certain regions, countries? Like, did you kind of just want to, go somewhere that made great wine, or did you have particular varieties or climates that you kind of were selecting where you went based on?
I tried to stay fairly open-minded. I wanted to work with everything in different climates, and experience more, because I think there's so much out there as a young winemaker, and I didn't want to lock myself down too much to hot climate or cool climate or super aromatics in the early phases. And I think just naturally I've started falling quite strongly for a couple of varieties such as Grenache and Riesling. And yeah, I really tried hard to work in very big facilities, very small facilities, and in different climates early on.
Where did the Riesling love affair begin?
Drank some good Rieslings in New Zealand. I think throughout Marlborough and Waipara and Central Otago, and then I reckon when I got exposed being in Australia, 2007 and 2008, got exposed to a lot of Clare and Eden Rieslings, and thought they were incredible wines. That these wines of austerity and dryness, but really lovely fruit as well, which was a very different style of wine from what I'd seen previously. And that got me very interested very quickly.
Did you have an opportunity to do any European Riesling vintages?
Unfortunately not. I've really focused now on Grenache, and off the back of that Grenache Gris and Grenache Blanc and Macabou, which I also really enjoy. Would absolutely love to go and work in the Rheingau or in the Alsace, but I probably have got to the point now where I really need to focus and dial in on the 1%ers, maybe less so than spreading out more, and I'm doing that. So for now.
Where was the when was the first time you kind of started to settle down a little bit and try to have a bit more consistency and stay in one place?
Had a good crack at it and a big thought around it in 2013, actually in Central Otago. I'd made a great relationship with Alexandra and Edouard, who are my business partners that are currently based in Beaune, and we'd had some good time together where we'd shared stories and shared aspirations, and thought that we would do business together, but we just weren't sure how that was going to end up. So I did.
How did you meet them?
We met in Hawke's Bay. So Edouard's family were distributing a lot of high-end Australian and New Zealand wineries throughout Europe. So he was over working for Craigie Range as a sort of a stagiaire experience to learn more about viticulture and winemaking in New Zealand. He then went on to Shaw and Smith to do a similar role. And Alexandra, who's now his wife, she had moved to Craigie Range in a marketing role, having finished or during the Master of Wine Business through University of Adelaide. So we just sort of coincidentally met, and then we shared a lot of good wines and shared a lot of good stories. And from there, we, without any really rules, we knew we wanted to do business together. And there was some sort of key strengths between marketing, business, winemaking, viticulture that we all believed in. So yeah, we tried to launch potentially a Central Otago-based wine business that was going to be sales in Australia in 2013. That didn't unfold. I came back to the Hunter in 2014 and had a great opportunity to work with a nice vineyard and had some space to make a bit of wine. So I made the call and said, look, I'm starting off with some Hunter Semillon, and I'm doing it, and it's going to be skins fermented, and it's going to be barrel fermented, and do you want a piece of it?
Right. And
they said yes.
Okay. What was your impetus to work with Hunter Semillon in that way?
I really thought about it before we decided that, or before I decided that I was going to make wine for our own business. An important factor was going to be producing something different. I think from a very low resource point to start a wine brand to try and compete against the great classic producers of Australia would have been a mistake for me. So I really thought about some of the techniques and processes that I've been playing around with over the previous sort of 10 years, and how that could create a product that was unique, identifiable, and was interesting, probably in a place where Australian sort of wine styles were starting to make a bit of a change in that really small producer bracket.
Did you have were there certain producers from Australia, for example, that you kind of used as good reference points for working that way? And how were you kind of introduced to these techniques and approaches previously?
There wasn't a lot of Australian producers that had inspired it, mostly because I hadn't spent a lot of time in Australia. I was coming and sort of doing a vintage and then getting out. But there's always just those little bits and pieces you pick up throughout the cellars, throughout the world. We started playing with some skin contact with Grenache Gris and Macabou down in the south of France in '09. And some of it worked really well, some of it didn't work at all. There were, little bits and pieces that I picked up along the way, but there certainly wasn't a technique where I'm like, okay, that's how I'm going to make my wine. It's more of a feel of if I put a whole bunch of parts together, that hopefully the sum becomes greater.
And so, tell me, how did the hunter experience go?
It was really good. It's obviously a very classic wine region. It's a region that's steeped in tradition, and I think doing what I was trying to do with the wine was really a respect to how good the classic producers really do what they do, and pushing a style that's different and not even really necessarily respectful to that varietal from that region was, I'm sure something that is always a little bit awkward. It sort of can either, freak people out or push them into a direction where they feel like it's not really a good example of what that region is. But I think generally the people were quite understanding and felt it, if not good, at least interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can imagine when you're working with a variety in a region that relationship is so iconic, do you take things away from, the norm and of the expectation is probably pretty scary. Not just for you, but also for the consumer when they're being introduced to characteristics, and personality of a wine that is so against the grain, it potentially could rub people the wrong way.
Yeah, and look, I'm sure it did. It's certainly nothing that I'm afraid of doing. I don't mind rubbing it up the wrong way, because it comes from the right place, and that's a place of actually respect when you look into it deep down, and also from a place of we need to be creative as winemakers, and not necessarily. I don't believe necessarily that all the traditional ways are the maybe even best way at showing terroir or whatever we want to call it. So we need to keep pushing the boundaries as probably southern hemisphere especially, with what's the tradition of Europe, and bring more interest to the game too. And it's clearly happening. We don't really even need to talk about it now, because it's there, it's being done, and there's so many great flag bearers for that in Australia, and I think all regions are probably doing it now as well.
So was this project solely yourself, or were you involved with Edouard's family?
Not with Edouard's family, just with Edouard and Alexandra personally. And their involvement was to come on as 50% partners, and we were going to make 150 cases of wine and work out the rest later. So obviously at this point they were in Bordeaux, where Edouard was finishing his Master of Wine business at the University of Bordeaux. And there wasn't a lot that they couldn't do anything physically with the winemaking or direct any of that, but there was always that supportive feeling of as this grows and we start to make a few more rules, I'm going to have a lot of skill sets, sales, marketing, websites, design, growth of the business, opportunity for export there. And even though we're 4 years in now, we've expanded the range a lot, and I guess Edouard and Ali's role now are really starting to kick in. We've just had our wines land in France, which is very exciting for a small Australian producer.
Mm.
Yeah, but we still don't have firm rules. We don't know what the end point is, or really how far it's going to go. We've sort of got to a point now where we're going to stabilize for a little bit and work on these small export markets, and try and increase quality.
Was the Hunter experience the genesis of Vanguardist, or was that something separate? And how did Vanguardist sort of start?
Yeah, I mean, Vanguardist really started when we met in Hawke's Bay. We spent some good time together, and obviously we didn't produce a wine there, and we didn't end up producing wine for a couple more years. But we knew at this point that we were going to do something.
Right. And so in terms of Vanguardist in its current form, how did that start? In terms of South Australia.
In South Australia, yeah, okay. So other than the love for Semillon and the real respect for the Hunter, I had that ethereal experience for me where in 2009 when I walked into the Grenache vineyards down in Moree, I was with Ben Rankin, which you know, and you've had him on the show.
Yep.
Yeah, former guest. I was working with him, and we went down into Moree, and he'd already been there, and he drove us down through these incredible terroir of pure black schist, and we turn up there, and my mind was just blown about these bush vines that were old and beautiful and flourishing in such a torrid environment. You know, it was hot and
Dry.
It was dry, and I almost instantly fell in love. So on the back of that, came searching. It was a bit of a sales trip / searching for vineyard trip with the first Vanguardist, Hunter Valley Blanc, it was called. Left Semillon off the label for obvious reasons, and came to Adelaide to show a few people the wine, and to look for vineyards. So basically Edouard had worked with BK and Taras when he was on his Australian experience, and we were very lucky that BK knew some people close to his vineyard in Blewett Springs, put me on to Mr. Robert Randy, who we work with still today, to find our Grenache vineyard.
Mm-hmm.
So that's essentially the story of the Grenache, and I had worked vintage in the Clare Valley with Knapstein, so I went there searching for Riesling, ended up taking a vintage job, and then ended up staying there for 2 years.
Okay, wow. Was that where you were making your wines as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. So in terms of starting, a long-term plan as far as building a brand, building a range, building consistency of wine supply, you have to, as you say, find vineyards. So you basically are approaching growers that have fruit available or don't have contracts with other wine producers. Like how does someone? Because I've had the experience in the last 3 years of kind of trying to find some bits and pieces here and there, but not yet getting to a point where I can kind of say, right, I want this much of this grape variety every year moving forward. How does someone, is South Australia a better place in Australia to find those kind of relationships?
I'm not sure. I think first and foremost being honest and being a good person when you knock on especially a small grower's door is an extremely good place to start, and starting very humbly with that grower is another good place to start, where in the example of the Grenache vineyard in 2015 when I took the first fruit, I had maybe about 15% of the vineyard, and they're 48-year-old dry grown bush vines that were planted by the man who owns it now. So he spent his whole life around it. So I learned a lot from him in the first year, and then we just have more and more discussions. On the back of that, I said, "Well, this is pretty much living my dream. I'm making Grenache off old bush vines, and the fruit's impeccable. Can I please have some more? And there was some pretty loose contracts that he was happy for me to take more in 2016. So I got about 50% of the vineyard by this stage. And it was more of an area. It wasn't to say, I'm going to take 5 tons or 10 tons. It's like, can I sort of work on that plot there?
And so when you say work on, as in you're getting out into the vineyards and you're doing the work, or you're working with
I do
them,
some
or
of the work.
kind of directing. Look, can we make sure that we're not irrigate? Well, if it's dry ground, obviously we don't have to worry about that. But as far as sprays and that kind of thing,
Yeah, certainly directing would be a good way to put it in the earlier days, and I think quite strong directing now, but in a place that we can have really great conversations about it, because he's been on that vineyard for 48 years, and for me to come and tell him that this is what we need to do, what we have to do to move forward, I think would be a real big mistake.
right?
I think in the next 3 to 5 years, I mean, it's our dream that we buy this vineyard,
Right.
and if we have enough money, we will be able to buy the vineyard.
Mhm.
So it's a really a long and slow development of the relationship, the cultural practices that we're using in the vineyard, and talking about really looking after this vineyard, and even trying to pay more.
Sure, of course.
Which I actually keep on raising the price each year on the fruit.
Right.
He hasn't asked for more, but there's other people that are around that have seen the vineyard and used the vineyard that really want the fruit as well. But I've actually got to the point now where I have the whole 3.5 hectares of
Yeah.
the grenache.
Right. Okay.
solely.
And there's no discussion about leasing it and working it yourself.
There is. We're in those discussions now. So
Yeah, cool.
I actually meet with them next week and look at potentially leasing the whole vineyard and taking him out of the picture as far as him having to drive around and drive tractors and look after contractors. So that's the sort of 4 years where we've got to now, which has been a great journey, and we'll keep working together until hopefully I can purchase the vineyard and look after it for the rest of my lifetime anyway.
So those first 2 vintages were spent at Knapstein.
Yes, yeah, correct.
When you kind of were starting from scratch in that in that environment, as far as your brand, did you have an idea about, firstly, how you wanted to work with the fruit in the cellars, and then I guess, did you have direction as far as a range of products, or did you kind of say, look, I'm just going to try and make everything the best that it can be, and then I'll make decisions down the line as far as blends and that kind of thing?
First year was small batch. Like it was, we went from 150 dozen of Semillon, Hunter Valley Blanc in 14 to 15, about 150 dozen of Grenache X Blewett Springs, and about 150 dozen of Riesling X Clare. So although there were quite a few techniques used, skin contact, barrel ferment, it was only ever going to be one blend. And that was the amount of growth that we could afford, physically to pay for, and to bottle, and then the amount of time that I could spend to market it.
Sounds very familiar.
Yeah. It's a common, probably commonest story amongst maybe 100 young winemakers in Australia right now.
Yeah.
And then off the back of that, we were able to double growth again in 16. But this is the point where I wanted to create a lot of batches that were looking at different pick times. So we would pick the vineyard at least twice, if not up to 5 times per vineyard now, to give us a spectrum of flavors, a spectrum of acidity. And then we're talking skin contact, barrel ferment, and stainless ferment. And I wanted 2 products. I wanted a product that was spring release. It still had the same integrity. It was the same fruit as Vanguardist, but in a fresher style, a less polarizing style. I wanted that, and at a cheaper price point. And then it also helped me really push further Vanguardist as a style. I can use a lot more skin contact, a lot of barrel ferment, and when something doesn't work, it comes into that fresher style that might be fermented in stainless, and makes that stainless more interesting, but doesn't take it too far.
Right. Okay. And so that's where you make decisions as far as for Petit, Vanguard, and the Vanguardist wines.
Exactly. Yeah. So in 2016, we actually released a brand called Safer Seal by Vanguardist. And we weren't real, as soon as we printed the labels, actually, I thought it was a bit of a disaster that I hated the labels and I didn't like the name, which is a weird time to make that decision. So we stuck with it for a year. But as soon as we basically bottled that wine, we were on the path for a new brand, which is now La Petite Vanguard. And it's something we're really happy with. We're working with a designer from Perth on the labels, Wildegrim, and it works really well with the brands. Is obviously, like I said, the same integrity in the wines, but they're really different styles. But it's what's really interesting is they come off the same fruit from the same vineyard.
Yeah, okay.
And it's a stylistic thing that creates a differentiation, and obviously packaging. And then the other thing, I guess, with that several picks per vineyard, we've got a lot more freshness and natural acidity early on and a lot more concentration later. But it's often Vanguardist needs quite a bit of that carbonic to brighten it up a little bit.
Right.
And La Petite needs some of that fleshier, later pick stuff
Yep.
to give it a little more structure.
Yep.
So they work quite harmoniously.
Yep.
And I think still bring quite different wines to the table.
And obviously you'd got to a volume where you could isolate sort of the best parts of the wine to be bottled under Vanguardist and therefore be able to charge a more premium price for it, because you could then have the more entry point and still kind of make all the money back.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's like I'll say to people when we're tasting, it's not a real qualitative difference between the wines. It's a real style difference.
Sure, okay.
And that style sits in two really different segments of the market. I like to think that the La Petite Vanguard wines will hopefully always over-deliver, because we're putting all of that effort into the fruit, which is everything. And it's the same fruit as what we put into Vanguardist, but we'll bring a really different style to the table with Vanguardist versus what La Petite Vanguardist is delivering.
And obviously, you know, a big part of what you're doing is spending time in the trade and actually selling wine yourself, which is what you've been doing here in Melbourne. Do you think that it has been really helpful for you as far as being able to engage with buyers, decision makers, and in some cases the final consumer, in kind of providing some feedback and helping you make decisions for future vintages?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real important to me. I love the business of wine as well, and being able to gather that experience that is viticulture, is winemaking, is writing invoices and showing and chasing invoices and
Best statements,
all of that stuff, and working with somms and working with chefs and working with the customers, the final end user, is actually an amazing experience. It's really humbling, and it's something that I love doing. I think sometimes I feel guilty that I should be spending more time in the vineyard or more time in the winery, but I really love the time in the trade as well. And it teaches you so much. You get a really good feeling of where the wines are at, stylistically, price wise, volume wise.
You're able to see what else is going on in the market and you know what trends are happening as well.
Exactly.
So what's sort of the future or the immediate future showing for Vanguardist? You talked about doing some stuff over in France.
Yeah, so I think we've got to a point now where we're around about close to 20,000 bottles across 10 or 11 SKUs, which is probably too many SKUs, but it's not going to change. And we've struggled with cash flow as a small business, paying for that growth. So we're going to put the brakes on probably for a couple of years and really look at just increasing our relationships with the growers and the vineyards, which seem to be really set for now, even though they are all handshake agreements. So growing those relationships, spending more time in the vineyard, and not really looking at any more products or really any more growth in products. And then on the back of that, I guess probably our 3 to 5 year goal is to be able to purchase either some holdings in one of the vineyards we're currently using, or maybe some winery sort of holdings, or maybe a bit of both. Yeah.
Fun. And then you're looking at exporting as well.
Yeah, so we've it's a really new game for us, and to have Colt Wines back in New Zealand to support us with that early transition into New Zealand with a couple of pallets has been awesome, and it's very, very exciting for us to the wines turned up in Bone after being held up in Rotterdam for nearly 3 weeks last Friday, and I believe that Alexandra is actually in trade in Paris today. We've got Edouard heading to Bordeaux next week, and through Edouard's contacts, we've actually got a distributor for the north of France, which have a really incredible portfolio. So it's going to be nice to have our wines in there as well.
Awesome. Well, look, I've certainly enjoyed tasting some of the wines recently, and I'm looking forward to seeing how things evolve and grow bit by bit. But it has been fantastic to have you on. I really do appreciate you making the trip and making some time. Is there anything upcoming as far as events or new wines coming out you'd like to let the listeners know about, and possibly direct them towards some website addresses and social media accounts?
Yeah, so we've got the new release of 2017 Vanguardist, which has just been rolled out throughout Perth, Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide as of Sunday. Instagram, vanguardistwines.com, and the website. Some pretty cool new projects in the line for another project, which is Sommelier Wines of mine as well. So that's having a bit of fun with that at the moment. So yeah, good times ahead.
Yeah, cool. Well, all the best with future vintages and lots of wine sales as well.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Vincast. I have been James Gansbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and as always, you can follow me on social media at Intrepid Wino on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and you can follow the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. Please do check out my YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino. Lots of different videos there, including almost 200 Let's Taste videos, one of which was for Vanguardist Wines, and lots of different other experiences, including my winemaking as well. Make sure you subscribe, leave a comment, like a few videos, and share it on social media as well. You can follow the podcast on iTunes, Player FM, Stitcher, Podbean, iHeartRadio. Subscribing means you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available. You can access the back catalogue, and also it's a great way to provide some feedback to myself and the listeners, and also the guests, importantly, by leaving a rating and a review. I really do appreciate everyone who has left a review recently. As always, you can find that information on my website, intrepidwino.com, as well as ways of getting in contact with me there. And I'd love to hear from you. I've got some great guests coming up as well. But until then, bye.
Earbuds, Melbourne's podcast network. earbudsnetwork.com